we're good to go. So I'm so pleased to welcome Dr. Hart to be with us today. I know that histamine intolerance seems to be a topic that we get a lot of questions about, and so we're eager to get going. I'm going to spotlight you, Dr. Hart, just so that everyone can see you. There we go. And if you are not currently muted, if you could just take a chance at it, not you, Dr. Hart, we'll keep you unmuted. But if everyone else could take a second, just mute yourself. And I'm going to share my screen and pull up our presentation, and we'll get rocking and rolling here.
Katie, is my audio okay?
Yep, I can hear you great.
Perfect.
Slideshow, here we go. Here we go. Perfect. All right. Let's see. Can I get a thumbs up if you can see the presentation and Dr. Hart? Yes, cool. That's great. Okay. All right. Dr. Hart, welcome, and I'm going to turn it over to you.
Thank you so much. And I'll just give you a next slide when we're ready, okay?
Sounds good.
So everybody, we're going to be talking about understanding histamine intolerance, as these lovely ladies have introduced today. And thank you, Mary Institute, for having me. So I am the senior doctor at the Biologix Institute, as many of you know. So let's just get started. Next slide, please. So I thought I'd introduce it with a patient profile of mine who ended up having histamine intolerance. She was a 55-year-old female. She reported with us with Lyme disease diagnosis. She came basically assuming that most of her symptoms were due to the Lyme disease. And so she had a long list of symptoms, including insomnia. She had some whole body itching. And then she had wired but tired feeling, intense anxiety. She had obsessive compulsive tendencies, rage episodes, tachycardia, numbness and tingling in her arms and legs, chronic UTIs. And a key finding there with that was that not all the time would the UTIs always test positive for bacteria. You know, maybe only third time would it actually test positive for bacteria. Joint pain, tremors, loss of appetite, broken blood vessels across the face, acid reflux, liver pain, bladder pain, and general irritation. So she had, when she came in, what we found was she did have a major case of mold. Now the Lyme disease, the Borrelia infection was not as big of a player, but Bartonella, which is a co-infection, was pretty high up there, and she had parasites, okay? So we worked with those, and she had improvements. She did really well, but it was a bit like whack-a-mole, okay? We would get the Bartonella load down, and then parasites would flare, or we would get parasites down, and then her body wouldn't be able to detox the mold. And it was like we were playing this whack-a-mole. So in general, we were making improvements, but there was lots of this. Okay, and I couldn't sort it out until suddenly we put together a pattern, okay? And it was hard to discern at first because of all this other stuff going on. But the pattern that immediately hit me was her bladder pain would react to certain foods. And pretty quickly early on, I realized they had nothing to do with UTIs, okay? And that was almost rarely a variable. But we started to associate some foods with it. And then we started measuring her histamine levels, a whole blood histamine, and saw that it was well over 120, which is pretty high. And when we slowed down on some of the other treatment, managed the histamine, and then started to deal with the way the body processed the histamine, suddenly we could make more predictable progress, and the progress was much smoother with the other aspects. So what I would say is if I had a do-over, I would start with balancing out histamine intolerance from the get-go, which would have allowed me to make much better progress from the other ones. And so it's sneaky, you know, from her perspective, especially with the intensity, like the itching and some of that stuff was a much lower intensity at first compared to the obsessive compulsiveness and the numbness and tingling everywhere. So that's a case result of why it can be so sneaky sometime, and so why it's important to look for it. So now we'll go on to why to look for it. So let's go to the next slide, please. Great. So what is histamine intolerance? Very simply put, histamine is a natural amino acid, a natural molecule that we need in our body. But when it's in excess, when it's too much for us to tolerate, it becomes toxic. Okay, so histamine is made from the amino acid histidine, which we get from foods. General function stimulates digestion. It's important in blood flow, immune function, inflammation. It regulates brain function. It's an immune molecule, it's a neurotransmitter, and it's actually also a stress hormone. Let's go to the next slide. So what does it do? What are some things that histamine does for us? One of them is vasodilation. It opens up the blood vessels, okay? So if you're hot on a hot day and you start to sweat and get red, well, that's histamine vasodilating your blood vessels to release heat through your skin. And that also helps to regulate blood pressure. It also increases the leakiness of your blood vessels. That helps the immune system to allow things to get through where they need to go. It increases glandular secretions to help with digestion or immune function, with like mucus and things like that. It regulates your sleep and wake cycle. So it stimulates your brain for you to keep you awake. That's why Benadryl can make you sleepy, because histamine helps keep you awake. It releases stomach acid for digestion. It's needed to release stomach acid. It stimulates neurons to fire. It regulates our appetite. It helps our smooth muscle contractions happen, like that was part of digestion, and our bronchioles and other things like that. It's a main player in sexual function, has a big role in pain. It's a big role in immune function, so attacking is part of attacking infections and things like that, and inflammation to injuries. It helps move our mast cells around for us. And it's a major neurotransmitter regulator. So not only does it stimulate neurotransmitters in the brain, stimulate neurons, but it regulates the other ones. So it can play a huge role in mood, depression, anxiety, things like that. Let's go to the next slide. That's when histamine's playing nice. But what happens when it becomes intolerant and toxic? Well, at that point, that's when you just reverse all those symptoms, right? So now all of a sudden, all that great vasodilation becomes flushing and low blood pressure. Those leaky membranes become leaky gut, leaky brain syndrome, leaky blood vessels, and edema. We get increased mucus. A lot of times, you know, you're having histamine intolerance when you eat something and suddenly you got all that mucus in your throat happening. That's a good sign that maybe you're either intolerant to the food or you're having a little histamine intolerance. Poor sleep, right? Just like I told you about that patient, you're wired but tired. So your day and night cycles get dysregulated. You start getting acid reflux because there's too much histamine in the gut producing acid. You get burning, itching, and rashes on the skin, or maybe hives. You start having food reactions because of the histidine content. Your appetite dysregulates because of the load of appetite in there, or the load of histamine in there. Those same neurons that we want to fire to make thoughts happen or keep us awake, now they're firing like crazy and we're feeling overstimulated. Smooth muscle suddenly becomes smooth muscle cramps or spasms. So that can create bronchial constriction. That can create diarrhea because the bowels cramp down. You can have sexual dysfunction at that point. You can have increased pain, bloating, swelling, edema, inflammation, fluid retention. Your immune system becomes reactive. You get increased mast cell activation, increased mast cell movement. So that means the mast cells may activate more often. And then you get neurotransmitter dysregulation leading towards anxiety, depression, mood disorders. So that's what happens when that histamine gets imbalanced. You just reverse the list. So let's go on to the next one. Let's go on to the next slide. So how do you pinpoint that that's what's happening for you? Because that's very, those symptoms are all over the place. So if you just have a couple of them, it can be tough to pinpoint. Maybe you have loose stools because of histamine, but maybe it's because of, IBS or a parasite or whatever, or a bacteria in there. Or maybe you have acid reflux for other reasons, and so it can be difficult to pinpoint. So how do we do that? How do we start to look at that list and say it's not a different cause, but it's histamine? Well, you want to take a really good case history. Really start to understand what are the triggers, when do you flare, when did this start, what was your background like, etc. So you want to look for more than just the classic histamine symptoms, which are like rashes, flushing, itching, digestive issues, mucus, congestion. You want to branch out to that whole list and see, whoa, okay, are there some disparate patterns that we're putting together here? You can do a whole blood histamine. Sometimes that's tough because you might have to be in a flare, but in general, I'm looking for, if people are over 70, I'm starting to consider on the whole blood histamine. And if they're over 100, I'm definitely looking at them for histamine intolerance. You can do an organic acid test to look at histidine and histamine levels in the urine. You can do just a symptom questionnaire, basically take that list of functions that I gave you and see, do you have issues with it? That'll lead you to look at that route. You can do genetic testing, looking for basic single nucleotide polymorphisms, right? Genetic mutations that affect your ability to break down histamine. You can do single allergy testing, or they'll also do prick testing on the skin. Well, they'll actually put like a 1% histamine solution and see how you react to it, right? Or you can do the dermomatographia, which is where you write on the skin and see, do you get red marks after? And then one old school orthomolecular test that I don't necessarily recommend patients do, but it's interesting history, is they would give you flushing niacin that would make you flush. And they'd start at 25 milligrams, wait an hour or so, see if you flush, 50, 75, 100, and see how many milligrams it takes for you to have an intense niacin flush. Because that niacin flush actually comes from histamine release, okay? And if there's a spouse out there who doesn't know what histamine intolerance feels like, take 500 milligrams of histamine, niacin on an empty stomach, and you'll figure out real fast, okay? It's totally benign from that level, but it doesn't feel good at all. And so they would say, okay, if it takes you 150 milligrams or less to flush from the niacin, then maybe you have some form of histamine excess. So that's how we start to pinpoint, do you have histamine intolerance? Let's go on to the next slide. So before I get into what causes histamine intolerance, I want to talk a little bit about bioregulatory medicine and biological medicine and how that helps us understand histamine intolerance and the causes. So if you can see on my PowerPoint here, I start with input, okay? And input means everything coming into our system. It's what we eat, it's what we breathe, it's what we think, it's what's in the environment, okay? It's the relationships around us, all the input going into our system. Some of it we can control, and some of it we can't, right? You can't control the EMFs in the environment. You can't get them to turn off the radio tower, at least not today, right? So, but you can control some of the other aspects, what you eat, and the thoughts you think, and et cetera. So all of that's factor number one. When we bring that into our body, our information processing systems have to decide what's going on with that. So when you start to eat something and you start to chew it, your body's going, okay, how many starches are in this? How much protein? How much fat? And so based on that, before it even hits your stomach, your body's going, okay, I need to upregulate this much stomach acid. I need this much bile flow. Pancreas, we need this much starch enzymes, this much amylase, et cetera. And so that's all information processing the body's doing. And as we move down the list, that creates feedback, right? So we get the information and then the body creates feedback to regulate our systems. So it regulates our digestive system, our immune system, our nervous system, our detoxification system. And then if all's going well, we get adaptation, our body adapts, and that creates health, right? Somebody who can perfectly adapt to an environment is healthy. So that's when it goes well, okay? We have input coming in, we process it, we get good feedback, our systems regulate it, we adapt, we get health. Next slide, please. Now, we can take that system and add stress, and if it's all functioning well, we get even healthier. We get a little stronger for it. We get a little more resilient. Right? That's great. That's what we want to have happen. We don't want a life of zero stress. We want some stress so we can continue to adapt and have health. And it's a great, some well-being, right? Some mental excitement. Okay, let's go to the next slide. Now, if you add normal stress to a dysfunctional system, so let's say you add normal stress to a McDonald's diet, or you add normal stress to dysfunctional information processing or digestive issues. Well, it doesn't take much stress at that point to create maladaptation where the body can't adapt. And that'll eventually lead to dis-ease. Most of the population in North America, we live somewhere between maladaptation and dis-ease. We may not be manifesting pure diseases just yet, but we're kind of sitting in this blah limbo, okay? And then eventually, as that adds up, we get to disease, right? We start to look at, that's when we start to name diseases at that point. And so we can have normal stress plus a dysfunctional system, or next slide, please. If we had a great system, but the stress was really big, and even when I draw this on the whiteboard, I'll make a really big, right, stress really big on there. You could add, and that's trauma, that's a massive car accident, or a massive loss in the family, or, a massive toxin exposure, like the power plants, or a toxic exposure at work. Or I had one patient who was a farmer, and he accidentally one time dumped glyphosate all over himself, right? So those are massive stressors to the system. And so that in and of itself can start to break down the systems. It can either start to break down information processing or feedback or systems regulation, which again can lead to disease. And so now you add that to a poor input, right? You're eating bad and massive stress. It's only a matter of time for the average person until it manifests in disease, okay? So we need to keep this in the context as we start to look at the causes. So you can look at any good bioregulatory biological medicine practitioner, they might use different verbiage than I do, but they're looking at it from all of these angles, okay? So let's go to the next slide. All right, so that's the broad overview, okay? So, but let's check out now some particulars, okay? So very easily, if you're deficient in the enzymes that break down histamine, right? You've got excess histamine for various reasons we'll talk about, and or you can't break it down. So it just builds up on you. Well, the enzymes, the three main enzymes that break it down, DAO, diamine oxidase, HN methyltransferase, so you have to methylate out your histamine, or monoamine oxidase B, which is another one that breaks down, especially in the brain, histamine. So you could be deficient in these for various reasons. Number one, you could have some genetic SNPs where you don't make as much. Okay, that's a possibility. Number two, you could be deficient in the cofactors that make those enzymes work. Copper, vitamin C, B vitamins, methyl donors, magnesium, iron, those are all needed to make those enzymes work. So if you're deficient in those over a long enough period of time, the enzymes won't work well. Third is you can overburden those systems. Now, so let's say like the next one we'll talk about is dysbiosis. Well, having dysbiosis for too long will overburden the DAO pathway in the gut. And so you'll burn out DAO. You know, having methylation problems will burn out the HNMT pathway. And so that'll process it out. It'll burn out that enzyme. So you can overburden the pathways as well. The next cause that we want to look at is dysbiosis in the microbiome, especially the antihistamine probiotics. So some of the probiotics in our colon and the intestinal tract, they actually break down histamine for us, okay? Or they limit its creation in there. So the different bifidobacterium family, impetus, longum, brevi, they all break it down. So if you're deficient in those, or if you have dysbiosis where there's too much candida or too much pathogenic bacteria and they crowd it out, well, then you're going to end up with more histamine. And that can have secondary effects, like we said, with burning out the enzymes as well. Let's look at a few more causes. Let's go to the next slide. The next one is SIBO, or small intestinal bacteria overgrowth. That's where either you get pathogenic bacteria coming in, like maybe strep or E. coli, and they're living in your small intestine, or good bacteria, but it's from your colon, migrates up into your small intestine where it's not supposed to be, or it's too much in that area, creates SIBO. So that'll create digestive disturbances. SIBO in itself will start to burn out DAO for us. Some of those bacteria will actually create histamine. And then as our body tries to attack it, especially over a longer period of time, so the longer you have SIBO, the more likely your system's going to make histamine in response to it. You actually begin to overproduce it. So it makes it harder for you to break down the histamine you're taking in, and you're overproducing it in order to deal with the SIBO. So that's another major cause. Now, the causes of SIBO are varied. It could probably be its own lecture and podcast, but it can be slow bowel movements, decreased stomach acid, poor bile flow from the gallbladder. You could be eating high fermentable foods, things that break down into starches and carbs very easily that then the bacteria use to feed on. So all of those are factors there. Another one is parasite infections. So parasites, certain parasites in and of themselves will produce histamine. There's some good research on some different protozoa and things like that that produce their own histamine. And then the way our body goes to attack them. So our body will use mast cells, which release histamine to try to attack parasites. Our immune system will shift over into what's called Th2 dominance to try to attack them, which then makes more of our immune cells produce more cytokines and histamine in response to attacking them. And if we can't get rid of it, then it just keeps perpetuating. So it just creates this battlefield in the system where our body's trying to use, as part of that strategy, histamine to attack the parasite. And if we're not winning, it's just a constant struggle, okay? So it's a constant overusage of histamine at that point. Let's check the next slide. Mold toxicity, also known as chronic inflammatory response system syndrome, can also create histamine intolerance. So that can burden the gut, which creates secondary effects that create histamine intolerance. It also is going to create a high inflammatory state and that Th2 dominant state in the body. So it's going to constantly be creating the release of histamine from the immune cells. So mold toxicity is a big one I see causing histamine intolerance. Other chronic infections like Lyme disease, Bartonella, they dysregulate the immune system, which in of that self will create Th2 dominance and histamine reactions. And then it'll dysregulate the body balances histamine at that point and can start to burn out those enzymes again, which will create histamine intolerance. A lot of times, some of these ones are secondary effects, right? So in the short term, maybe the first couple months you have mold toxicity or Lyme disease or a parasite infection, you may not have histamine intolerance. But over the long haul, because it's a secondary effect, this is the root cause. But it took a little while for the histamine intolerance to settle in because it was a secondary effect. Let's go to the next slide. Stress is another big one. So like we saw with a biological or bioregulatory medicine flow, big stress will break down the systems and then create a secondary effect. And if you think about, when you're really upset, you flush a lot of times, right? Or you're really angry, you get red. Well, that's histamine release. Histamine release is happening and all that blood flow comes to the surface, right? So histamine in of itself, and there's different researchers, Morley Robbins is another one. He calls histamine literally a stress hormone. And if you think about it, it's true. And any of my histamine intolerant or mast cell activation patients out there, and any of you folks watching, you'll know, right? When you get stressed, it's worse. The reactions are worse because it's prompting more histamine release, right? So that's a big factor there. And any stress in general, so I'm talking more about like neuroemotional stress, but any stress around the system, poor diet can be a stressor on the system, okay? So anything that stresses that bioregulatory flow that we talked about, input, information, feedback, systems regulation, any stress, anything that puts stress on any of those pathways will be a stressor and can have effects on the body. And other field disruptors. So in biological medicine, we talked about things being field disruptors. They may not have been a problem before you had issues, but now that they are, they're going to constantly disrupt your body's field, right? So an infected tooth or a leftover wisdom tooth or root canal can be a big one. Poor diet can disrupt your whole field. Mercury fillings, all those dysregulate the body's field, put stress on the systems. They also produce histamine if they affect the immune system and dysregulate that or shift you more towards that Th2 dominance. So all of those are factors there that can be an issue. Let's go to the next slide. So before I touch on this, I want to just hit back onto that bioregulatory medicine flow. So if you take all those things I just talked about and you just slide them into the different slots they go into. So for instance, let's talk about mold for a second, okay? So mold will disrupt some of the different systems that we talked about. It'll disrupt the digestive system. It'll create an inflammatory state, disrupting the immune system. It'll disrupt hormones. It'll also start to disrupt membranes, okay? So that's a system disruptor. But for information processing, it disrupts the neurological system. It's confusing for the neurological system, right? It'll disrupt information flow through the extracellular matrix. It'll disrupt the membranes of cells so they can't communicate together. In our clinic in Biologix Center, we talk a lot about the body's fiber optic system, that crystalline matrix. Well, all of that is disrupted by mold, okay? So like around a cell, there's a water layer that's important for cell-to-cell communication. Well, mold just disrupts that like crazy, okay? And so what that means is that information processing and that bioregulatory flow is disrupted. So at that point then, from the get-go, your body can't hardly tell what to do with an input disruptor, right? So if you have an input that's maybe not perfectly right, or maybe it is. Maybe it's a food you don't have a problem with, but now it can't tell exactly how much enzymes to release. So you're getting stuck with some undigested food. And so then what's your body have to do? Well, it has to try to attack that to break it down now with the immune system, right? So we can plug each one of those causes in and see exactly how it starts to disrupt the whole flow, which is why it's so important to understand that when you're going to go approach it, because you can't just try to get rid of the histamine, because that's just one piece of that bioregulatory flow. Okay, so at that point, it's going to have, if you're not dealing with the whole thing, that's where you can get stuck in treatment. So I really wanted to hammer that bioregulatory, that biological medicine flow as we're looking at some solutions, okay? And I, of course, want to reiterate here, this is all for educational purposes. Please look towards your own health practitioner, your own medical authority when seeking treatment options. So let's look at some solutions now that might be possible from an educational standpoint. In the short term, right, we're going to get some relief in the short term. We look at a low histamine diet. That can give a lot of relief, okay? We can look at natural antihistamines, black seed oil, curcumin. You can do straight DAO, quercetin, things like that can be natural antihistamines for us. You could also look at supporting the coenzyme factors for DAO, HNMT, and MAOB, okay? So we talked about those. If you're deficient in copper, or you're deficient in vitamin C, or the B vitamins, or magnesium, or methyl donors, that'll be big for that pathway. For short term, if you can avoid the big triggers, that would be good. I don't want you to become a hermit as much as possible. I know for short periods of time we have to do it, but we want to avoid the big triggers with the goal and an aim to get you through the triggers, okay? And then we might need to replace some of the probiota with low and antihistamine probiotics, okay? With that, a lot of those Bifido family, there's a couple other, the Lactobacillus rhamnosus and some of those, but really the Bifidos are the really good antihistamine probiotics there. So that's a short-term solution. Long-term solution, to work with that bioregulatory flow, I highly recommend you find bioregulatory medicine practitioners. At our clinic at Biologix, everyone gets trained, all the doctors get trained in biological medicine and American biological medicine, because we believe that's so important to approach it from all those levels. And once you do that, once you start to approach that, it's a very stepwise process that allows you to do those things in a way that gives the most minimum pushback on the body. You know, we don't want massive die-off reactions. We don't want you to have flare-ups if we can help you from have it. You know, sometimes it's part of the process, of course, but we want to minimize it as much as possible. And so then that allows us to start to address the root causes like SIBO, like parasites or dysbiosis or the chronic infections. And so that's key as well. And then we got to restore the body's regulatory processes, either if it's the digestive system or start to rebalance the immune system or the neuroemotional system, start to rebalance some of that out. And then the information processing pathway, start to restore that. You know, sometimes in our clinic, we'll talk about restoring the body's software, right? We need to get it so it's processing the information appropriately. Once that happens, it starts to adapt on its own. And to some degree, you know, we may not have to address every little issue in the body, because when we're really hitting it from this angle, the body's adaptive capabilities take over for us. So I may not have to rebalance every single little thing. We just need to get the body to regulate itself again so it can pick up its adaptive qualities. From that point, I want to shift a lot of my patients from a low histamine diet to more of an antihistamine diet. So there's certain foods, and we'll talk maybe more about them as we go along here, but there's certain foods that are more, maybe not necessarily super low histamine, but they're antihistamine, right? And so from that point on, then we want to shift the diet in that direction. And what I have some patients do sometimes is do low histamine days, right? So eat your antihistamine diet, but maybe once or twice a week, we'll do a low histamine day just to give the body a break on the load. And then we have to remodulate the immune system to balance it with that Th1 and Th2. And there's more T helper cells than that. And that's its own lecture as well. But suffice to say, we got to rebalance and remodulate the immune system away from that. Okay, let's go to the next slide. So a big question for a lot of folks is, what's the difference between histamine intolerance, allergies, or mast cell activation syndrome, right? So histamine intolerance, hopefully you're well educated on it at this point, at least decently well. It's when excess histamine arises for multiple issues in the body. It's more than we can break down, right? That's histamine intolerance. Allergies are when you have a specific hyperimmune, hyperreactive response to a specific allergen, okay? Now, histamine intolerance may seem like you have allergies to everything, but what we would say is just a typical allergy is when you have an immune response to a particular allergen, okay? And then mast cell activation syndrome, and allergies, let me back up here. Allergies may or may not have histamine intolerance as a part of their issue, okay? Mast cell activation syndrome is where the patient's mast cells, and that's an immune cell whose job is to attack pathogens. It gets stimulated, we call it degranulation, where it squeezes and it releases all that stuff, okay? It degranulates too often and too frequently, okay? And so it's the threshold to do it is too low. That means instead of waiting for just a parasite or an invader to degranulate, it might do it constantly to the slightest thing. It might do it to stress. It might do it to a little bit of pollen. It might do it to the wrong scent. It's degranulating all the time, okay? And so those patients may or may not also have histamine intolerance, okay? They may or may not have a high histamine load. And so I've measured some of those people who have great histamine levels, but those mast cells are releasing tons of other inflammatory molecules as well. And so the difference is key there. So we've got excess histamine, we've got specific allergen attacks, and we've got mast cells that are degranulating too often with or without excess histamine. So that's the key there between those differences. Okay, next slide for me. So that's my lecture portion of the topic. I think we're going to take some questions now. I'll let you kind of roll that off.
All right, thank you so much. It was really appreciated, and I'm very glad we got everything straightened away. There's a lot of information. So I know we have some questions. We had a handful that were submitted ahead of time. I'll jump into those first. And then I would invite anyone else who has a question to go ahead and post it. I see that really quick, someone just asked if I could put the last slide up. One thing I want to mention is that if you registered for this event, which all of you have, you will receive a copy of all of the resources, including the slides, by next week. We also post those on our website, and I'll post the link shortly here from all of our BioBites series. So if you're someone who is trying to better understand your health, the health of a family member or friend, it's a web resource we make available, all of the recordings from all of our BioBites. So I'm not going to put up the slide just this minute, but I promise that I will come back to that, and it will be available online and in your inbox shortly here. But right to the questions. Let's see, I have an individual who says that they suspect their reaction to too much histamine may be involving their sinuses and ear canals. They talk about drinking a vegan protein shake every morning, and about half the time their sinuses become congesting and hearing is reduced as though they're underwater. If they drink a large amount of water, it improves. Otherwise, it'll settle down after a few hours. And they have stopped eating citrus fruits, including grapefruit, lime, and lemon for this reason. Could this be related to histamine in the body?
For sure. And so what a lot of my patients say is, it's tough because one day I react to food and the next day I don't. So sometimes she reacts to the vegan shake and sometimes she doesn't. Well, what that depends on is what's your histamine load in the body that day. Did you have a lower histamine load one day and you didn't react, and the next day you did? And the other aspect is a lot of the protein shakes, especially the vegan protein shakes, they've got a lot of extra fiber put in, or some of the proteins aren't really easy on the gut, right? And so they can someday react with it's maybe a little bit of SIBO. Some of those fibers may react and produce more of a histamine reaction at that point. So, and a lot, as we saw, one of the functions of histamine is to increase mucus, right? And so you probably are to some degree, not that I can, say for sure, but having some sort of a histamine reaction at that point. So what it sounds like, especially because it's coming and going, it sounds like you're still early enough that figure out what the root cause is. And then that should help a lot. But yeah, that would make a lot of sense, especially when it comes and goes like that. It just depends on your histamine load.
Very good. Thank you. All right, another question. And again, this is someone who's had a lot of different symptoms. They had what they think was a gallbladder attack, an event in which they experienced anaphylaxis and hives that only went away when they took frequent doses of Antranex. Also had psoriasis appear, gingivitis, infrequent sleep. These are all symptoms. They're wondering if this could be adrenaline dominance or histamine intolerance. Do you have any input on that one?
Yeah, so, one thing I probably didn't cover enough, but I maybe mentioned briefly, was the way the toxic load in the body can be hit with histamine, right? So anything that overstresses the body and the body has an immune response to. So if we have a toxic load and we have an immune response to that toxic load, it can produce histamine. And so that's a factor. And if the supplement you're talking about, which is like a liver supportive supplement, helps, maybe it's about clearing the detox pathways, which all has to go through the gallbladder. All that toxic junk coming out of the liver has to go through the gallbladder. So if you've got a congested gallbladder giving you potentially gallbladder attacks, your detoxification is going to be very slow. You're going to be prone to developing SIBO because your bile production is going to be very low. And all of that can then lead to histamine intolerance. And then if we kind of take it as two different questions, so that's kind of that side of it. And then we take the adrenaline dominant side. If somebody's really stuck in adrenaline dominance, number one, your hormones are going to be dysregulated. And there is a link between estrogen dominance, too much estrogen, and histamine intolerance. They do play hand in hand. And then some of the methylation factors that allow us to detox both of them get sluggish at that point with estrogen dominance, and then you can't methylate out your histamine. Okay, so they do play hand in hand very strongly together. And adrenaline dominance will play it up. So if you're constantly stuck in adrenaline all the time, fight or flight all the time, well, number one, your system's going to be releasing lots of histamine in the neurological system to stimulate those neurons, right? And then your immune system's going to be dysregulated because that's going to be suppressed and dysregulated. It's going to create histamine intolerance, histamine upregulation because of that dysregulation in the immune system. And then when you're releasing adrenaline, your body's trying to get blood flow to move better, right? So you can fight or flight. Well, that's regulated by histamine. And so it's going to upregulate that. So it's very strongly correlated, where many of my histamine intolerant patients are also adrenaline dominant, sometimes for different reasons, but they work synergistically, unfortunately, in a negative aspect to increase each other.
I want to dig a little deeper on two things you just mentioned before we move on in terms of these questions. One is you talked about detoxification, if your body's not detoxifying properly. And if you could just speak briefly to some of the key, maybe just lifestyle habits people might get into, or ways to detoxify in a safe way, that would be appreciated.
Yeah. So as I talked about, my approach with patients, especially using that bioregulatory flow chart, how do I get the different systems? It's a stepwise, right? So you kind of work your way backwards through the biological function of detoxification. So how do you get toxins out of the body? Well, there's 4 routes. You sweat them out, you breathe them out, you urinate them out, and you poop them out, okay? So we can start with doing those 4 things. Are you having good bowel movements? Are you staying hydrated? Hopefully you're breathing. And then can we get some sweat going, okay? So that's an easy way to start. And then the next route is, can we get the lymphatics moving? Can we get the organs draining? So can we just start, if we think of the amount of toxins in our body as a boiling pot, and there's maybe a Thanksgiving turkey carcass in there that's boiling, okay? And it's starting to boil over. Well, just doing that, getting the bowels moving, getting sweating, getting your lymph draining, that's like clearing some of the stuff off the top, okay? That clears the bubbles off and some of that fatty stuff. And then you got the funky stuff floating at the top. So that's like getting the body organs draining. In naturopathic medicine, a lot of times they'll call it the homunctories, right? So they'll get the lymph vessels inside the organs draining and the gallbladder and kidneys draining. And so that a lot of times take a little more specific focus, maybe some different bitters or different herbs and things, or homeopathic routes to allow those to drain, or we'll do some different synergistic therapies at the clinic here to allow those to drain. And that starts to get more of the floaty stuff off the top of that pot, okay? And from there, the next couple of steps, I typically recommend you, if you're dealing with a chronic illness or you're sensitive, you should do this with a practitioner, okay? But then you can start to get into phase 2 and phase 1 and methylation pathways and start to say, okay, what do I need to go into the pot and start to clean out, okay? And from there, that's looking at phase 2 and phase 1 detoxification and using binders appropriately and things like that, and starting to get more specific with laser detoxification protocols. But the very gist, I would say, get those 4 pathways up and running, and then focus on getting things draining and your lymph moving. Those are pretty safe bet for a lot of folks.
Thank you. That's excellent. And then the other question that I had as you were speaking, you talked about the relationship between estrogen and histamine in the body. And going back to a few slides, you mentioned some antihistamine foods, and I know there are some also anti-estrogen effect foods. Is there anything that you would kind of recommend that's high on that list for someone who thinks they're dealing with histamine intolerance or something related?
Yeah, so some antihistamine foods, some of them are the same herbs you might use, but you might start cooking with more turmeric or ginger, parsley. If you tolerate onions, those are all very good antihistamine foods. Watercress. There's a good 20 to 25 antihistamine foods out there, but those are some easy ones to get started on. Those things, some of the apple pectin, from an apple, those are typically pretty antihistamine. So those are great antihistamine foods. And anti-estrogenic foods, some of that's tough because some of the things that are really good foods are also very estrogenic, but broccoli and a lot of the cruciferous family is going to be anti-estrogenic. Anything that's high zinc containing is going to be anti-estrogenic. Avoiding things like alcohol, which is going to be big for histamine intolerance anyways. A lot of the big histamine, I call the big histamine foods, the pickled things, the fermented, the smoked, the processed, the lunch meats, anything that's preserved is a lot of times going to be a high histamine. And so a lot of those things are also going to be very estrogenic as well. So that's kind of an easy list to say, okay, let's put that off to the side for now. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. All right, another question. How does prickly heat when exposed to heat correlate with histamine intolerance, and why does it form a pimple-like spot afterwards?
Yeah, so prickly heat a lot of times is because you're actually having a hard time releasing the heat. And so your body's attempt to release heat is going to be a histamine release. And so if you do have histamine intolerance, you're probably gonna have a harder time regulating that heat release. But that's what stimulates prickly heat, is histamine at the skin surface of the skin, right? And so actually, when I joked about the spouses taking niacin, if you do that, you will get a prickly heat sensation. You might not end up with the pimples because it'll go away, but you get that prickly heat sensation. Now, heat intolerance that accompanies prickly heat, which is a lot of times also called a heat rash, will end up with a pimple because it couldn't fully release the heat and or the pores are blocked. And so it's essentially forming like an immune reaction at that level, trying to release the heat or deal with the pore blockage. So in the long run, you got to figure out what's causing that, balance the histamine, balance what's keeping you the heat intolerance going, but that's the gist.
Is there anything to be done to help the pores release that?
Yeah, so depending, as long as you can sweat, doing an infrared sauna is going to be helpful because it helps to, actually your skin is cleaner after infrared sauna than when you start. And so we always try to educate patients when you're in there and you start sweating, keep a clean towel and wipe as you go. Wipe as you go. And so then in Chinese medicine, we'll do some work on the side of that of releasing toxins or releasing maybe sometimes infectious microbes on the skin that need to be cleared to allow the heat to release. That's a big one. Regulating dysautonomia is a big one for approximating heat release in the skin. And then just dealing with the other causes of histamine intolerance if that's a factor.
Thank you very much. All right. Do you do you or your practice utilize homeopathy in treating histamine intolerance issues in addition to supplements and medications?
Yeah, homeopathy, anthroposophical remedies, those are all a big factor of what we do, especially within bioregulatory medicine and American biological medicine here at the Biologix Center. So we do, and for various reasons at various times, you know, one aspect is that they're a great way for sensitive patients to get things moving, especially in the early stages when maybe they're so reactive because they're so toxic and it's stuck, or their histamine's so high. It's a great way to start getting some of these things moving. Homeopathy and anthroposophical remedies, they're a great way to assess the information processing side of things. So I talked about input and then information processing. Well, homeopathy is a great way to deal with that level of information processing. So we definitely use those quite a bit here.
Great. All right, another question. We've got a lot of them. Would histamine intolerance be a factor that causes very infrequent but severe illness after eating, where digestion shuts down for 4 hours or more, followed by severe vomiting, and then recovery is almost immediate once the vomiting stops?
Yeah, so that one's pretty in depth, but it could definitely be a factor. You know, if the bowels shut down, right? If for whatever reason, an autonomic response, there may be a blockage somewhere, there may be a mechanical blockage, for whatever reason, they shut down at that point. Well, there's nowhere for the food to go. And so the body being intelligent, its next route it's going to do is to get rid of it, right? So of course you're going to feel relief once you get rid of it, because the body says, oh, okay, you take all that load.
I'm just listening to this BioBites thing.
So,
she just said hi.
There we go.
we good to go? Okay.
Sorry.
No worries. Oh, I thought I was doing something wrong. Okay. Okay, so that's a key factor. So some of that may be histamine intolerance. And so depending on also, you know, for some folks that the histamine-induced cramping in the small intestine creates diarrhea. But for other folks, if it's hard enough, it could create a blockage. Or due to the blockage, you get secondary histamine intolerance. So it's a route I'd look at. But of course, the key factor is you need to figure out why is your digestive system shutting down after a meal and not overacting.
Mm-hmm. Very good. No, we just a good reminder to people to remain on mute, but no, we're perfectly good, and thank you for addressing that. All right, another question, it's having to do with kind of the order of operations. Would you address histamine before addressing mold or Lyme?
So the way to address histamine, and the way I explain this to patients, is when we start to sort out what's gonna go on, I'm gonna do three things. I'm gonna support the issue that's there. I'm gonna look to find and correct the cause. And then we're gonna support the body when I call the 2 Res. Repair the damage that was done as best we can and retrain the body to do these things on its own, okay? So I'm gonna start with support. So I'm gonna try to give you a little short-term relief so there's enough freedom for us to work on the root cause. So I'm not gonna get crazy on trying to fix your histamine intolerance right away, but I just wanna give you enough support so that there's a little bit of freedom for you symptomatically and enough room for me to work towards the root cause issues and re-regulate the body. So a lot of times I'll address it somewhat, but then as quickly as I can, I'm trying to move on towards re-regulating the body. So like that with that case study, we probably didn't address histamine. I know we didn't address histamine intolerance early enough, and it would give us a lot more freedom to work on the other guys, and it would allow us whack-a-mole had I just even supported the histamine intolerance a little bit more and then quickly moved on to the root causes. Mm-hmm. So I hope that answers the question.
I think so. Very good. So just to say back to you, right, you want to try and create conditions so that there's a bit of alleviation on the histamine intolerance, and then you can look and see what else is going on and work on those things.
Right.
Very good. All right. So an individual who does not take medication, has high levels of fitness, is postmenopausal, is asking, they're saying that they do not have any allergies, they've been tested, but they're continually and indiscriminately suffering with hives. Could this be histamine related?
Yeah, a lot of times it is histamine related, especially, if they're doing like stereotypical food intolerance testing, they might not be noticing your body's histamine reaction to the foods, but it's just the immune reaction to the foods, which may be different, right? So you may be so that's the difference between allergies and histamine intolerance. So you may be having a histamine response at that point. And if you're having hives, we know to some degree histamine's involved, right? So I have some patients who are high hives patients that are more of a mast cell case and some that are more histamine case. But either way, can you start to track, like one option is to say, can I start to track my hive load based on histamine for me? Like what's the pollen count outside? What foods did I eat? Did I eat high histamine foods yesterday? And sometimes, depending on where the histamine intolerance is at, like, is it in your enzymes? Is it in the way you break down the neurotransmitters? And so you might have to do a 3-day track. Okay, 2 days ago I ate high histamine foods and it's hitting me now, okay? And so you need to keep a track of that. I've also had some histamine intolerance cases where they never had hives and it was Lyme disease that triggered it, right? That's what triggered their and so it's hard to pinpoint until we started dealing with the Borrelia at that level, until we started supporting the body and dealing with the Borrelia. But so it could still be histamine intolerance, but you have to find the triggers and the cause.
Very good. I think we're coming up on time. I have 2 questions I want to get to. One, hopefully it's a little quick and easy here. It's asking about sauna use. It's asking whether you recommend far versus near versus a combination, and if there's a particular brand that you'd advocate for.
Yeah, in the clinic, we use a combination of all 3, near, mid, and far for the most optimum benefit. If you're home, I typically recommend a far infrared. It's an affordable option. It's kind of the best of both worlds. It's very affordable and it gets you a lot of good detoxification benefit, right? If you can afford the whole shebang, get all 3. But for at-home use, I often say, let's get far infrared just to create that good in-between balance. We use sunlight and saunas and high-tech health saunas here in the clinic. So those are the ones I typically recommend. There are some smaller, so they'll offer some personal saunas and like 2-person on upsize saunas. There are some people who have found some good personal saunas, but those are the 2 companies we work with the most.
Very good, thank you. All right, and a good question here. Someone is asking if you could speak a bit more about the neurological impacts of histamine intolerance, specifically thinking about mental illness, Parkinson's, but just also generally neurological impact of histamine intolerance.
Yeah, histamine intolerance and histamine itself as a neurological modulator, regulator, as a neurotransmitter itself, it plays a large role. So it's got a large role in schizophrenia and different neurodegenerative diseases like Parkinsonianism or Parkinson's. And so, but just even itself, because it's regulating that. So if it's dysregulated, it will create dysregulation in dopamine, for instance. So if like histamine's too dysregulated, you might end up with depression, but it's an angry depression, right? Because your system's so overstimulated with histamine, but your dopamine's in balance or your serotonin's in balance. So it's like an angry depression. That's hard. Or if you're wired all the time, you're going to be anxious. If your neurons are firing constantly, you're going to be anxious and overstimulated. And it's not just always neurologically, the whole body may be overstimulated at that point, right? And so that's a big factor there as well. And so, and then the way that, so it's twofold, right? It's twofold in that front of how does it regulate the other neurotransmitters? And then how does it itself function on the brain, right? So it regulates all those. So those are out of balance. They're going to create anxiety and depression. And then on the other side, it's going to overstimulate your nervous system when it's too high. And the third factor from a body perspective, what does it mean when you have histamine, right, in the system, high amounts of histamine in the system? It usually means there's a problem, okay? So if your body is on a natural level releasing high histamine, it means there's an allergen, there's an immune event, there's a pathogen attacking it. It means you're under stress and you need to run away and pump blood to the muscles, and so it's releasing histamine, right? So if you're releasing that all the time, what's the messages to you in your brain? Danger, danger, danger. So you might be stuck in fight or flight. So you might be edgy. You might have rage attacks. You might be irritable because to your brain, you need to fight and flight constantly. And so those are a big factor as well. So it's not uncommon for histamine intolerant patients, especially when they're in a flare, to suddenly maybe go off on a spouse or a loved one because they can't keep it in anymore, and they're not meaning to. And I'm not saying this as a it's not a freedom to go be a brat, right? But I'm saying they're just so overwhelmed neurologically at that moment that they need a minute to go regather themselves because there's so much neurologically happening with that histamine that it can create those rage episodes. And it's also up to that person to understand that those happen and to find ways to modulate them, right, in the short term while they're dealing with the histamine intolerance.
Very good. All right. I know we're coming up on time. If I can squeak in a quick question, because someone had asked about genetic relationship to histamine intolerance. You mentioned it earlier. Can you say roughly what percentage of patients you see with histamine intolerance are represented by some genetic polymorphism?
Yeah, I would say about 25% have a really strong genetic polymorphism, like maybe some homozygous issues with DAO or HNMT. But maybe another 30 to 45% on top of that have some mild dysregulation that basically they would have been fine had they not had some other trigger that issue. And then the rest maybe don't have it, but their pathways are dysfunctional.
Very good. All right. And truly last question, I'm going to stop, but just as a question of clarification, someone did ask one more time, what brands do you recommend for a sauna?
Sure. We usually use High-Tech Health or Sunlight here in the clinic.
Awesome. High-Tech Health. All right. So all this will go into the notes. I am going to stop there just out of respect for time. Dr. Hart, I am so grateful to you for joining us today. This has been very educational. It's a lot. But as I said, take heart. I'm going to post a video of this on our website as well with the slides with your permission, and then notes, which we will get out within the next week. And this will all go to everyone's email as well, and you're welcome to share. I did post briefly. This is every Tuesday, first Tuesday of the month, we do a BioBites. Next month, we're doing one on IV therapy for those of you who are curious about that. And we're looking forward to having more biologics practitioners join us in the months ahead as well. So just again, thank you very much for joining us, to all our participants and to Dr. Hart. Very grateful to you.
Thank you guys for having me, and I appreciate you, and I appreciate what the Mary Institute's trying to do. Thank you guys.
Thanks. Have a great day all. Bye.